Hello, this is Albert Dom, and we are talking today about Canto 11. And I might note that this is approaching spring, and I can tell because I'm having a allergy attack, more than I usually have. So if I cough and sneeze, I'm going to try not to. I'm going to try to edit that out if I can. If I do, or you hear rattling of a water glass, and you'll know what that's all about. But hopefully everything will be fine. We'll just continue on in our journey. And here is the situation. We had just visited Farinata at Cavalcanti, the heretics in their tombs. And now we're going to proceed onward and down into the next circle, the circle 7, the circle of the violent. So this is where we're at the beginning of the canto. We reached the curved brink of a steep bank, constructed of enormous broken rocks. Below us was a crueler den of pain, and a disgusting overflow of stench. The deep abyss was vomiting, forced us back from the edge. Crouched underneath the lid of some great tomb, I saw it was inscribed. Within lies Anastasius, the Pope Photinius, lured away from the straight path. Well, so Dante said they're going to head on down to the next level, but boy, does it stink. And they're still in the circle of the heretics, sort of the suburbs, if you will, the outskirts, and they see the tomb of Pope Anastasius. And they're saying, well, Pope Anastasius is a heretic, and he's sitting there. And that is kind of interesting, a pope that's a heretic. Well, as it really turns out, this is basically, on the part of Dante, a case of misidentification or mistaken identity. And Pope Anastasius was pope in the end of the 5th century, from about 496 to 498, I believe. And at this point, the great councils of the 5th century have been over, and one council in particular was the contention that Dante is really addressing. And this was the Council of 451, the Council of Chalcedon, which this decreed that Jesus was truly God and truly man. He had two natures in one person. That's a difficult doctrine if you really stop and think about it. It's hard to understand exactly how that works, and people of the 5th century are having trouble. And there is a split. There is what we would call the Catholic or Orthodox viewpoint of God and man perfectly joined, two natures within Jesus. And there's a so-called monophysite idea that there was really only one nature in Jesus. He is divine. His human was basically subsumed into the divine. And the West was basically Catholic, and much of the East, particularly Egypt and Syria, was monophysite, or so-called monophysite. Well, this is a controversy, and it really started to split the church into two, East and West. And this was one of the early controversies, and what really people take 1054 as a split of the church in the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic. And really, there was multiple splits before then. And if you look at the history closely, you'll see that there are splits. And really, in 1054, no one expected this latest split to be a permanent. But as it turned out, it was, and it became the date that we use to talk about the split of the Eastern Church from the Western Catholic Church. Now basically, as you can read here in this slide, Pope Anastasius II really desired to try to heal this split, so he sent some bishops to Constantinople. Well, the way we get the mistaken identity was that the emperor, the Eastern Roman Emperor, was Emperor Anastasius I. They both had the same name. Now, Pope Anastasius II tried to heal the split, and was a conciliator. Pope Anastasius II was Orthodox. He did not, as we can tell from history, really compromise the faith, although he was certainly suspected of that, especially from some hard-line people in Rome and in Italy. The emperor, on the other hand, just wanted a solution, and he was perfectly willing to come up with some type of compromise, or that he didn't really think it was going to be a problem with the faith. He was something of an amateur theologian, but nonetheless, he came up with some ideas that were definitely heterodox. Now, you read in this slide, during the medieval period, Anastasius II was often considered a traitor to the Catholic Church and an apostate because he was conciliatory, and that got misunderstood. The writer of the Liber Pontificalis, supporting the opponents to Anastasius' efforts, argued that Anastasius' second death was a divine retribution that he had broken with the Church. Similarly, the Decretum Gratiani writes of the Pope that Anastasius, reproved by God, was smitten by divine command. This medieval view is described by modern commentators as a legend, a misrepresentation, and confused tradition, and manifestly unjust. In other words, enough of historical research has shown that they really didn't treat him quite correctly. But Dante didn't know any of this, so Dante placed Anastasius II in the sixth circle of hell. I guard Pope Anastasius, he whom Photinius drew from the straight path. However, modern Dante scholars consider this to be a mistake. The person Dante intended to put at that level was the Byzantine emperor, Eastern Roman emperor of the time, Anastasius I. Anastasius II is, with Pope Liberius, one of only two of the first 50 popes not to be canonized. So, but at least, by the way, for Pope Liberius, he's recognized as a saint within the Eastern Orthodox Church. So he gets some consolation there. And here's a engraving by Gustave Doré of Dante and Virgil here before the tomb of Pope Anastasius. You can see that, and then they're sitting there smelling the fumes and not being very happy about it. So this gives Dante a literary device to stop a while and talk about the various circles and structures of hell. Here we continue with Canto 11. Our descent will have to be delayed somewhat so that our sense of smell may grow accustomed to these vile fumes. Then we will not mind them, my master said, and you'll have to find some way to keep our time from being wasted. That is precisely what I have in mind, he said, and then began the lesson. So we're going to begin the lesson too. But before we do this, this is an abstract painting of them delaying before the tomb of Pope Anastasius, and it's called The Stench of the Abyss. And sure enough, I guess that's what it is. Okay, now here's some commentary from Columbia University. This canto reveals a canny and interesting choice on Dante's part. He has delayed his exposition of the structure of hell. Not until we are 1/3 of the way through the Inferno does Dante offer us an organizational template of hell. What are Dante's reasonings for postponing an explanation of the ideological basis of his hell? Ideologically, the structure that is now revealed is profoundly counterintuitive. Rather than basing his hell on a Christian template, for instance, a template based on the 7 deadly sins, as we might have thought that Dante was doing in the early circles, we pass through lust, gluttony, and avarice in the order that conforms to the hierarchy of deadly vices. Here we learn that Dante chooses to base the organizational template for his hell on a pagan philosophical text. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Now we continue. My son, within these boulders' bounds are 3 more circles, concentrically arranged like those above, all tightly packed with souls, and so that later the sight of them alone will be enough. I'll tell you how and why they are imprisoned. All malice has injustice as its end, an end achieved by violence or by fraud. While both are sins that earn the hate of heaven, since fraud belongs exclusively to man, God hates it more, and therefore far below the fraudulent are placed and suffered most. In the first circles below are all the violent, since violence can be used against 3 persons, into 3 concentric rounds it is divided. Violence can be done to God, to self, or to one's neighbors, to him or to his goods, as my reasoned explanation will make clear. Now here he's talking about the next circle they're going to explore, we are going to explore too, which is the violent. And it's going to be divided into 3 subsections. The violent to self. First of all, we have violence to neighbors, then violence to self, then violence to God. By violent means, a man can kill his neighbor or wound him grievously. His goods may suffer violence by arson, theft, and devastation. So, homicides and those who strike with malice, those who destroy and plunder are all punished in the first round, but all in different groups. Man can raise violent hands against himself and his own goods. So, in the second round, paying the debt that never can be paid, are suicides, self-robbers of your world, of those who gamble all their wealth away and weep up there when they should have rejoiced. One can use violence against a deity by heartfelt disbelief and cursing him, or by despising nature and God's bounty. Therefore, the smallest round stamps with its seal both Sodom and Cahors and all those souls who hate God in their hearts and curse his name. In mentioning Sodom, he's going to be talking about sodomy, as it was called and sometimes still is, or homosexuality. Now let's look at the commentary. Virgilio then outlines the sins of violence, which will make up the 7th circle. He divides the sins of violence into 3 categories: violence against God, violence against oneself, and violence against one's neighbor. He further indicates that each category can be inflicted in 2 ways: as violence against persons, as violence against possessions. The result is the 2nd circle is subdivided into 3 rings, each of which houses 2 modalities of the same kind of violence. So first of all, we have ring 1, the violence against others in their persons or their possessions. And that would be Canto 12. Ring 2 is violence against the self in one's person, as suicide basically, and in one's possessions. That's Canto 13. Then ring 3 is violence against God. First of all, in his person and in his possessions. A further complexity to which I will return below is that for the purposes of this taxonomy, God has 2 possessions, nature and art, and that therefore there are 3 kinds of violence against God rather than 2. It's basically, again, you have violence against God, you have violence against God's possession in nature and God's possession in art. Dante's taxonomy of violence thus harbors a positive evaluation of material goods, implicit in the idea that material goods should be protected from violent deprivation. So Dante is no communist or hard-left socialist. He believes in private ownership. Dante's taxonomy of violence is therefore another indication of the Aristotelian mode of Inferno 11, a mode that distanced Dante from, for instance, a Franciscan approach towards material goods, which we also find in the Commedia. As I discuss in the essay Dante and Wealth between Aristotle and Cortesia, extremely divergent perspectives on wealth and material possessions coexist in the Commedia. In other words, Dante goes from one end to the other, the idea that private wealth needs to be protected, to also the idea that sometimes private wealth can be a sign of evil or wrong if you accumulate and hoard it. So it's obviously a complex topic, and Dante recognizes it, and he has a complex relationship with it. Fraud that gnaws the conscience of its servants, and we're continuing now with the Canto, can be used on one who puts his trust in you, or else on one who has no trust invested. This later sort seems only to destroy the bond of love that nature gives to man. So in the second circle, there are nests of hypocrites, flatterers, dabblers in sorcery, falsifiers, thieves, and simonists, panderers, seducers, grafters, and like filth. The former kind of fraud both disregards the love nature enjoys and that extra bond between men which creates a special trust. Thus, it is in the smallest of circles, at the earth's center, around the throne of Dis, that traitors suffer their eternal pain. Now he's describing the eighth circle, the one after the circle of the violent. Here we have fraud. And the type of fraud in the eighth circle is just regular fraud. You're defrauding people for some reason. But then in the ninth circle, you're defrauding still, but you're defrauding people who have a special reason to trust you, their family, their friends, their your country, or your leaders, or God himself, actually. And then it says there at the earth center around this throne of Dis. Dis is another name for Satan. Now Dante has a question. We're continuing on with the Canto. But what about those in the slimy swamp? Those driven by the wind, those beat by the rain, and those who come to blows with harsh refrains? Why are they too not punished here inside the city of flame if they have earned God's wrath? If they have not, why are they suffering? And he to me, why do you let your thoughts stray from the path they are accustomed to? Or have I missed the point you have in mind? Have you forgotten how in your ethics reads those terms explicates in such detail? The three conditions that heaven hate: incontinence, malice, and bestiality. Do you not remember how incontinence offends God's least and merits the least blame? Now, ethics is Aristotelian ethics, Aristotle's ethics, and then incontinence is not just, you can't hold in your pee or whatever. It's just you can't hold in your desires. You're incontinent, and your desires just overcome and master you. Now, here's some commentary. At this point, Dante basically says, I don't really get it, and asks why other sinners they saw in the earlier part of hell were not confined to the city of Dis as well. Virgil's response is appropriately frustrated. Dante, just when I thought you couldn't get any stupider, you ask a stupid Florentine question like that. Use your head for a moment. Outside of Dis, Virgil explains, those sins are damnable. They are not the sins of malice. For instance, Francesca didn't sleep with Paolo because she was trying to hurt her husband. The prodigal may be horrible people, but their sins weren't committed with the intention of causing harm to others. Then Virgil asked Dante if he's ever read Aristotle, because if he had, he would understand that incontinence offends God less than malice. Continuing with the Canto, if you reconsider well this doctrine, and then recall to mind who those souls were suffering pain above, outside the walls, you will clearly see why they are separated from these malicious ones, and why God's vengeance beats down upon their souls less heavily. Once again, they're sinful, but they are not fraudulent. They're not as evil as these people. Now Dante asked, go back a little bit once more, I said, to where you said that usury offends God's goodness, and untie that knot for me. Philosophy says, and more than once points out to the one who reads with understanding, how nature takes her course in the divine. intellect, and that it's artistic workmanship. And if you have your physics well in mind, you'll find, not many pages from the start, how your art too, as best it can, imitates nature, the way an apprentice does its master. So your art may be said to be God's grandchild. From art and nature, man was meant to take his daily bread to live. If you recall the book of Genesis near the beginning, the usurer, adopting other means, scorns nature herself, and in her pupil art, he invests his hope in something else. Now, usury, the charging of interest, we'll talk about in some detail when we get to Canto 17, where we meet the usurers. But basically what's being said here is that usury is not something natural. The charging interest is really making something breed, say money, that doesn't have the natural right to breed. But as I said, we'll talk about this on and on, because the medieval church certainly prohibited usury in all forms. As we know now, we are allowed to charge interest, and we'll have to, at least at some point, explain how that change, or not really a change, but evolution of thought on the topic occurred. Now, more commentary. Dante expresses this principle more fully through a simile. He adds in verse 104 that our art follows nature in the way that a pupil follows a teacher. And finally, the poet gives the principle of mimesis, a genealogical twist, saying that our art is thus almost God's grandchild. Which, that's an interesting thought, is it not? Art is God's grandchild, and we are, in essence, creating through God. Dante has constructed a genealogy. Nature is God's child, and human art is God's grandchild. That is also a theory of art. We note in the transition from divine art in verse 100, human art in 103. As such, it is a theory of realism that is essential for understanding Dante's view of his own art. He is a poet who heroically strives to imitate nature / reality to the best of his ability, so that my word not differ from the fact. Now, here's a commentary on the people in the 8th and 9th circle, the fraudulent. And this is from Father Longenecker. You can get a hold of this in this website here. They lie. Lying is the most dangerous sin because the sinner himself eventually believes the lie. An intentional lie in the 8th circle is the kind of lie that is told to further the liar's interest and to knowingly harm another person. This is Dante's deep divide. The lie, and then in the 9th circle, the traitorous, are the root of all the other sin. You might say pride is the root of all other sin, and that is also correct. But pride also has at its heart a lie. Humility is honest and free. Pride is always a cover-up, denial of truth, and a living lie. Tony Eastland makes a sobering point in his commentary that the depths of hell are reserved for all kinds of liars, because a lie attacks the very foundation and root of language and reason. Nothing stands if there is no truth. Everything crumbles because of lying. Now, here is a terrible realization about our relativistic society. The whole thing is built on the gigantic and overwhelming lie. Relativism teaches that there's no such thing as truth, or if there is, then there's no way we can articulate it accurately. Pope Benedict XVI warned of the dictatorship of relativism, and he was right, because if enough of us believe there's no such thing as truth, then we must find someone or some other system that offers us the security of certainty so we can live our lives. And certainly that this whole issue is and thought is a commentary on our times. And once speaking commentary, more commentary. In the Aristotelian model, vice partakes of the same impulse as virtue, but carries the impulse to an immoderate and excessive degree. For Aristotle, vicious behavior is distinguished from the virtuous behavior by the incontinent degree to which the impulse is pursued, not by demonizing the impulse itself. In this context, we can better understand that for Dante, desire is spiritual motion. Desire is impulse that is not itself vicious in itself, but is indeed essential to spiritual life. And indeed, we're all following impulse of some sort, aren't we? Impulse towards God or impulse away from God. And now here is a remembrance of the overall structure of hell. This is upper hell, and we see the circles we've already gone to. This is the city of Dis, heretics, and we see now we're going to have to descend down, and this is the next circle, the circle of the violent, divided into 3 parts. Then, after we get through that, we have even longer barrier to go down to the 8th circle, which is the circle of fraud, which is divided into 10 malaboges, or translated as evil pockets, containing each of these various types of sinners. And then we come to the worst area of all, the 9th circle, containing the traitors of kindred, country, guests, or lords. And then in the center of all this, frozen in ice, is the devil. And if we look again at where we're at, the circle 6 and 7, we see again here circle the city of Dis, circle 6, which we've just gone through, the heretics, and we're about to enter into the circle of the violent. We're going to encounter the Minotaur, next canto, and again divided into 3 circles. Ring 1 is this river, which contains the violent against neighbors. Then we have a wood of suicides. The suicide side have been transformed into trees, or bushes really. And then the final circle, so say subcircle or ring of circle 7, is the ring of burning sand, in which you have the homosexuals, the blasphemers, and the usurers. Then you go down this great barrier, which you'll have to get a monster Gary on to carry them. You come to this next circle, the circle 8, which has its 10 subcircles: panderers and seducers, flatterers, simoniacs. That's people who sell church offices for gain. It's named after Simon Magus, who in the book of Acts accosted St. Peter after he'd done a miracle, and said, well, how much for that power? How much do I need to give you so you can give me that power? And St. Peter said, the heck with you. You can't do that. You can't sell the Holy Spirit. But the descendants of that idea continue to think that they could, and they did, particularly in the Middle Ages, and really many of the ages of the church, and sell church offices and other things for profit. And it's interesting that St. Peter is also Simon, and then we have Simon Magus, the one who's the great opponent of the Holy Spirit here, and they're both Simon. You have next circle, have sorcerers, barators. That's basically your crooked politicians, and good Lord, there's going to be plenty of them from the 21st century and the 20th century. Hypocrites, thieves, deceivers, sowers of discord, falsifiers. Then you go down to the next circle, and here it's divided into subsections too. And here the traitors to their kindred, to their country, to their guests, and to the lords are encased in various amounts of ice, and this is called fraud complex. And if you want a funny version of this is a Dante's Inferno academic edition from PhD Comics, which has a lot of funny comics about the academic life, most largely the scientific postgraduate education where you're striving to get a PhD. You can see we have 9 circles here. We have limbo. What are we doing with our lives? We have lust. Ooh, look at these figures. We have gluttony, free food. Then the 4th circle is greed. I want all the references. 5th circle is anger, darn code. Then 6 is heresy. What if our advisor is wrong? What? No, never. Circle 7 is a violence, which we're about to see. And this woman is attacking her computer. 8 is fraud. I'm not good enough. And finally, at the very bottom, 9 is treachery. Very sad. All right, we can pause briefly and ask, what are the heretics in this circle we're just leaving, and not in another circle, for example, swords and discord? Indeed, some are, kind of, but basically, Dante is using a model that doesn't really very easily deal with heretics, because there really weren't any pagan heretics. But they sort of somewhat fit here, and I love this picture, by the way. It's called the Fortress of Faith, a 14th century Flemish manuscript. You see the Pope and the various monks and everything holding on the Fortress of Faith that's being attacked by all these various folks here. Well, to conclude this, or really get to where Dante is looking at the situation, we have to consider the concept of virtue, and virtue as an Aristotelian idea, which really has come on into the church. And what is virtue? And virtues move towards what is good. Ancient traditions, Greek and Roman philosophers, named and practiced the virtues. And these are the 4 virtues, main virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. Both ancient and modern religions recognize similar virtues. The early church adopted Plato's core virtues as cardinal. These are the cardinal virtues. Cardinal virtues comes from the cardinus or hinge, and the idea being that these are essential but also human virtues. In other words, unaided by grace, one can have temperance, one can have fortitude, one can be just. Now, there are virtues that you could not exercise without being in a state of grace, and we'll get to those in a minute. Those would be the theological virtues. But here we have temperance. Temperance is subdued temperance with frugal moderation. She binds your passion. You have fortitude. Brave, strong fortitude, stubbornly facing odds. She conquers all things. And prudence. Prudence, wise and slow, does not run fast and stumble. Store her in your heart. And then justice. Thirst after justice. She pursues peace and reason with honest goodwill. And again, maybe looking at it more from a Christian viewpoint, we have prudence. It's the ability to make right choices in life. It tells us what we should do in order to be faithful to Jesus. Justice helps us live honestly by respecting the rights of others. An unjust person thinks only of him or herself and their needs. Temperance, the power to control ourselves, physical needs, emotions, etc. Fortitude, the courage to help us face danger and difficulty with inner peace. It allows us to carry out our duties even if it requires great sacrifice and suffering. And a great example is, of course, the martyrs of the church. Now, the theological virtues. These 3 virtues are those that you cannot hold without the grace of God. And the grace, the free gift of God, bestows these virtues to you and different people for different amounts. And these would be hope, love, and faith. And these are the 3 theological. Okay, again, based on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Thomas Aquinas identifies 4 cardinal virtues and 3 theological virtues. This is just re-emphasizing what we said. Cardinal is from Latin hinge. The cardinal virtues are the 4 virtues that are the source of all other virtues, also known as the 4 virtues that all virtues hinge on, or the door to others. And again, temperance, fortitude, justice, and prudence. The virtues are the gifts from God that leads us to live in a close relationship with Him. The virtues are like habits. They need to be practiced. They can be lost if they're neglected. The 3 most important virtues are called theological virtues because they come from God and lead to God. The cardinal virtues are human virtues acquired by education and good action. Cardinal comes from cardio, the Latin word for hinge, meaning that on which the others depend. And during the last talk, I emphasized the idea that the theological virtues can be somewhat imitated, but they cannot really exist at all in a non-believer. Once again, an atheist, for example, will tell you, well, I can be good without God, and in a sense they're right. The cardinal virtues can be acquired by human beings, but not the theological virtues. An example I've given a number of times, and I gave it at the talk, and I'll give it now, is the ancient one that occurred in the 4th century. Constantine, as we all know, legalized the church and started favoring the church eventually. And he died, and he had his various family members who became emperor in turn, and they were just kind of vicious towards each other. Then in about 361, you have a great nephew, Julian, who becomes emperor. Julian had pretended to be a Catholic, but he really wasn't. He was really a pagan, and when he became emperor, he dropped all pretense. He said, well, I'm going to restore the pagan world and the pagan supremacy over against the Catholic world. And I just might say parenthetically, this may not have anything to do entirely with the story, but this demonstrates the falsity of the idea that once the church became shall we say, the leading faith in the empire, that it killed all the pagans. Well, it most certainly did not. The pagan world faded out somewhat gradually, and you can see, some 50 years or so, a little less, say 40, after the Emperor Constantine legalized the church and made it the leading force in the empire, there were still plenty of pagans around for Emperor Julian to rally, and we will know of accounts in the following centuries of pagans still being around. Well, Emperor Julian wanted to go against the Catholic faith, or as he called it, the Galileans, and he said one of the good things, or good ways of doing this, is to practice some of the things that they did, such as helping people. We might call social outreach. And you pointed out, it says you got to do this because they not only help each other, even help us. So he gathered the leading chief priests and what have you, the various pagan cults, and said, now from now on, you need to practice the same idea. You need to help people. And the pagan priests bowed their head and said, yes, Excellency, we will do that. And they tried, but it did not succeed. And why did it not succeed? Because they could imitate, but they did not have the real Christian theological virtue of love. They couldn't have it because they did not have baptism, did not have the faith. So it eventually failed, and this ersatz charity did not succeed. And another example, which I often give also, is a modern example. I've been to India, and at one point where India, I was talking to a Catholic priest who was showing some of the things they were doing in the town, and he remarked, he said that Christians make up 2% of the total population of India, but are responsible for 33% of the charitable giving and charitable expenditures in the country of India. So once again, let's look at what we got. Temperance. And we're going to look at what we don't have in the Inferno. What's the opposite of temperance? Well, it's the sins of the wolf, which we saw at the first early circles of hell. Fortitude. What's the opposite of fortitude? The sins of the lion. In other words, the violent, which we're about to see. And finally, opposite of prudence, it's the sins of the leopard. So I hope you can see at least a little bit now, and maybe see even more as we go along in the Inferno, how the structure of Dante's Divine Comedy, at least the Inferno, is situated with this idea of the four cardinal virtues. You may wonder where justice is. Justice is in all of the Inferno. So again, this is sort of the outline. Understand how Dante hangs his project together. Now, that's the story of Canto 11. Now, I want to draw your attention to the Dante Inferno test, which did not come out very well. I copied it. I can't make it look much better, but basically, you get it right here. Here's the web address, and you put in the various questions. I gave you some of them. They have a bunch of questions. Answer yes or no, yes or no, yes or no. You know, like, have you ever been attending religious worship lately? Yes, no. Have you suffered suicidal thoughts? Have you been in physical fights? Answer these questions, I guess, honestly, and you can be put into a circle. Now, I basically did one where I answered the questions. I'm not going to tell you where I ended up, but this is one where I basically answered very few of the questions, so I ended up in limbo. And you can see a little story about Charon ushers you across the river Akon, and you're in limbo. And actually you have a low chance, the way I answer questions, of being in purgatory, but a high chance of being in limbo. And this is kind of disturbing. A moderate chance of being heretics. And I say again, I'm not a heretic. I didn't answer the questions right this second time. So, thus we have Circle 11. And of course, after that comes, Circle 11, Canto 11. Shame on me. You know what I mean. Canto 11. And look at this. I think I talked through this without hardly coughing. At least I don't think I did. You can tell me if I was coughing all through this. And now I'm going to go and read some more Dante and suffer through my allergies. And I hope you guys don't have much in the way of allergies, but I hope you have a lot of Dante study. And I'll see you next week.